Good evening. My name is Dorothée Imbert, and I'm the head of landscape architecture at the Norton School, and it is my pleasure this evening to introduce you to João Gomes da Silva. João Gomes da Silva comes to us from Lisbon. In the past 30 years, he has both affirmed the position of landscape practice in Portugal, a country which is notorious for its architects, or renowned for its architects, I should say, as well as acted as a representative of Portuguese landscape architecture in academic institutions across the world, having taught in the United States, France, Italy, and Switzerland. This semester is teaching a studio at Harvard, which has allowed the GSD students, the lucky GSD students, to visit the volcanic islands of the Azores in the middle of the Atlantic, and for him to visit us in the middle of Ohio. So we are very grateful to the Cambridge crew. When I say that João has affirmed the position of landscape architecture in Portugal, he has done so through a series of collaborations established early on. In the 1980s, he studied landscape architecture at the University of Évora, about 100 miles east of Lisbon, a fairly new program in a very old university, which was over 400 years old, that was led by a very important figure in the crafting of a Portuguese landscape and environmental identity, a man named Gonçalo Ribeiro Teixeira. At Évora, João spent 5 years acquiring a design education that was very different from the studies in agronomy that would have been the norm, before acquiring practical experience and pursuing a thesis with the renowned architect Álvaro Siza. When he graduated, João not only embarked on a teaching career with Ribeiro Teixeira, but he had the fairly unusual first job of acting as the resident landscape architect for Siza's Malagueira project. For about 10 years, João worked with Siza to develop a new urban typology in response to the agricultural and drainage structure of the surrounding region. Following these dialogues between architecture, urban design, and landscape architecture, João collaborated with other well-known architects such as Sotomora, João Mateus, Carré de Graça, and many others whose name I will not even try to pronounce. Over the past 25 years, he has taught at Penn, Versailles, Berlin, Milan, Sassari, and Mendrisio. This is relevant not only because these invitations are indicators of recognition, but also because they are testimonies to his intellectual curiosity. Teaching informs his practice and vice versa. Through the firm Global Arquitectura Paisagista he founded in 1994 with Inés Norton, he has tackled a multiplicity of scales, from infrastructure projects to academic campus, art institutions, such as the Serrals Foundation in Porto with Álvaro Siza, and bicycle path, and received numerous awards. Across these scales, one can detect a particular geographic affinity for water, from the beautiful Salinas pools, which were the recipient of the Barcelona Biennial Award, to the Garcia de Horta Gardens in Lisbon, the fishing harbor in Povo de Varzim, and the coastal promenade in Madeira. I believe that he will discuss some of his more recent waterfront projects this evening. Last night, we talked about Portugal's cultural and commercial expansion over the centuries, and how national, as in colonial, identity was not tied to the acquisition of land, as it was for countries such as France, the Netherlands, and Great Britain, but rather to the establishment of commercial communications through outposts across Africa, India, and China, to name a few. Through this lens, we could look at João's exporting of the very specific regional, maritime, cultural landscape identity of Lisbon across the world. He can equally bring the volcanic landscape of the Azores to Harvard students as he can take in the landscape of the Midwest, from the Great Lakes to the Central Ohio Strip mines. This design and intellectual reciprocity is what allows me to hope that he will consider coming back to our shores for a longer stay. Please join me in welcoming, for the first time, João Gomes da Silva.
Well, thank you. Thank you so much for these optimistic words of presentation. I must thank the director of Norton School for this invitation, and of course to the head of Department of Landscape Architecture, Dorothée Imbert. Are you listening in the bottom? Because I think it's now. Oh, okay. Are you listening? Is it fine? Okay. So I was thanking Dorothée Imbert by this invitation. Of course, it's to me a pleasure to be here with you and to share some experience and thoughts about landscape architecture practice. So I called the thickness of time this lecture because somehow by moving along the landscape of Lisbon, the margin of River Tejo, it allowed me to speak about several works and projects I participate and collaborate, and somehow some of those projects act as a kind of archetype of the others and allowed me to have a bigger thought about what we were doing in that place. So I will speak about Lisbon, my hometown, the town where I live and work mostly, and at the same time the renewal process of the city, taking in a moment, in a period where as a kind of counter-cycle of the general situation, the city is emerging into a better situation. And I think this sequence of projects and works in which I participate or collaborate are part of this. So let me put you several hypotheses and talk about several experiments. The first hypothesis, which is fundamental for me, is that to take the idea of landscape as a construction, as a form of architecture of the territory, with its specific tectonics and everything is okay now.
Everything is good now.
Yeah, thank you so much. The second point, the second hypothesis, is taking a landscape as a result of a cultural formation, a social and cultural formation, and of course as a spatial transformation. The third hypothesis is taking landscape as a palimpsest. The fourth is considering memory as a spatial construction, as an hypothesis. So the five experiments are both projects or works, completed works. The first one is the Alcáçova of Lisbon, which means the core of the Islamic city of Lisbon. The second one deals with the old arsenal of Ribeira das Naus. The third one deals with a competition, not a one competition, but a competition nearby the others. The old Ribeira Velha, so the old port of Lisbon, we may say. The fourth one, it's the result of a competition, now a project and beginning a construction in the few months, which is the new cruise terminal and the Gardens of Tobacco. And the last one, it's not a project, or it's a project, but it's not a work, because it's more an installation which somehow contributed to the activation of the port city of Lisbon. So I want to show you this very known image about Rome, in which Rome as a city is represented both as a landscape. We can see the valley where the river is crossing, the hills, and the bottom of the plain where the city developed. And then the representation of the fragments of the city, the fragments of architecture of the city, and the fragments that are still present as concepts and as images of our knowledge. And this is a representation of Lisbon, the Lisbon city, the center of the city, in which you can read a lot of things. You can read the river and the margin, the terrestrial part of the city and the river. You can read its shape, its morphology, the various tissues. You can read the bottom of the valley with its grid, perfect grid. And you can read the geomorphic tissue of the hills. So you can also read the public space, both the open space, but also the public buildings. And what we see in this image is the representation of that space more or less 10 years ago, in the beginning of this, this process of transformation. And what happened is that the government of the city and the port authorities and also the government decided to create a fund to invest in the in all the waterfront into nucleum, trying to create a positive answer to the depressing trend of the center of the city, which was being the void of population, void of function. But I can tell you that in that square, it's concentrated the most significant ministerium of our government. So in the first floor of those buildings, it's concentrated the government since more or less 300 years. Somehow the transformation that is here represented as an hypothesis, because not all of these projects will be built. Some of those are already built, some others will never be built. But what brings me to this representation is one hypothesis, and that hypothesis is to deal with the invisible city lying under our feet, which could represent a relation, the creation of a relation between our time, our contemporary life, and the past, the memory of this place. So the first project which was realized, it's the old Alcáçova of Lisbon, which means the core of the Islamic city. In the castle, of course, in the top of the hill. So the project deals with this idea of sedimentation and palimpsest. It has to do with the idea of time revelation, the idea of sedimentation and palimpsest, and this idea of archaeology as a kind of surgery field. When you go to an operation, the doctor opens your body and create what they call, doctors call a chirurgical field, operation field. So through that opening, they can interact with our body. Somehow, it's what we found that an archaeological site could mean. So this is a project developed in co-authorship with Carrilho da Graça, which is a preeminent architect, Portuguese architect, and our studio. So I'm talking about the castle in this hill with this geomorphic and very old urban tissue that was formed more or less since 1,000 years ago, when Phoenician came and Greeks established a kind of commercial place. Then Romans, then medieval period brought Islamic society, culture. Lisbon was part of Al-Andalus, the kingdom which occupied more or less all the Iberia. And somehow this was one of the important cities, not only because it was a big city, but it was in contact, direct contact with the ocean. So it was open to the world. So more or less along 12 years, archaeologists were digging inside the castle, trying to excavate a place they found when they tried when the municipality tried to do a parking plot. And they start digging and excavating, and they found a lot of remains. And this representation, it's a typical archaeological drawing in which they represent a very different and complex situation. And for us, and I think for everybody, it's very enigmatic. We can recognize traces of buildings, but sometimes they superpose, sometimes they don't match. And the reality is that this drawing represents more or less 4,000 years of a place. So different times of the same place, different spaces of the same place. So it's a kind of enigma. And what we thought was that we should find an architectonic dispositive to deal with this apparent enigma. So what we proposed was this diagram, this organization, in which we recognize the present time in the gray area all around, so the present level, and then this very tiny line which represents the cut of the ground and the cut of time, and then several moments of the same space. The older one, it's this dark gray, which represents a sanctuary from the Iron Age, more or less 4,000 years from now, and 5 meters deep from the surface. So we have different levels and different times, but all together in the same space and at the same time today. So our answer was a system, an architectonic system made of retention walls, stairs, ramps, so typical elements for landscape architecture and architecture, and also a system of structures which should cover some of these remains which were more fragile and should be protected following the instruction of archaeologists. So what we did was to find the right places to fix the pillars, which should be put very carefully in between those archaeological remains, and then start creating a kind of retention wall without, almost without thickness, to represent a cut in time and in space, and with a material which would not be identified with those periods. So to avoid ambiguity. And the geometry of this line should result not coming from design idea, but from the reality which we should present and represent. So this is a general view about the place in which we can recognize some of the walls of a palace of the 16th century, the remains of 2 houses from the medieval Islamic period, a part of 16th century palace, and some remains that should be covered and protected because of the rain effect. And this kind of box which should cover the 5 meters deep excavation. And what we thought to be an hypothesis was to build a kind of model in a very light material of the 2 houses, representing not only the volumes, the openings, the typology of the houses, but also covering the place, the inner spaces, and giving the experience of the volumetry of those 2 houses. So we had to work a lot with archaeologists and structural engineers to sustain that structure only in 6 points, avoiding walls and avoiding archaeological structures. So it was a kind of static balance we had to create. So these are the covering maquette models of the 2 houses in which you can go in, you can experiment the divisions. This structure doesn't touch the remains, but allowed you to go inside and to experiment the typology of the houses, the way of living, and protects some of the fresco paintings of these Islamic houses, which were very interesting and very beautiful. So you could have the experience of different levels of time and different historical periods. a system of communication, so diagrams and schemes and informations were placed. And we used the white stone, which helped to build all the city, this white stone, and the blades of steel to create a very non-ambiguous language about what we were representing. When you are in a space like this, these remains always have the same level and you cannot perceive at distance. So one of the most important things was to create a kind of gestalt, a kind of contrast between the remains and a dark bottom. So we choose these steel blades, which now are almost black. They stop the oxidating process, and now they create a kind of frame about these realities. Some windows were open in specific places to show specific materials. So there was a kind of program we had to develop with archaeologists to allow us to visit the place and to understand the place. For example, in this covering structure, we created a reflective, a kind of mirror effect surface, which allowed you to see the tiles which are there, the mosaic tiles, without having to go to an upper position, so it retained the scale of the ensemble. The second experiment is the old arsenal of Ribeira das Naus. And I think it deals with the idea of time experience, the idea of destruction and emergency, and the very important thing that is collective memory. So I'm talking about all this area, which is represented already as the project and the work which is already completed, which is a kind of twin space with Praça do Comércio, which is the main square where the government is, and the city celebrates the contact between the square and the river and the southern light. So it's a kind of twin space, as you shall see. So this is Lisbon, beautiful, extends, occupying a kind of plateau with several valleys running north to south, as you can more or less read in the urban morphology. So it's a very expressive urban landscape. At the left you see Monsanto, which is a park, more or less 900 hectares park, connecting the city with the surrounding cities. So now Lisbon, it's not only this landscape in which more or less 1 million people live, but it's a more broad reality, more or less with 3 million people living in all this metropolitan region. So for Portugal it's significant area. Of course, it's nothing compared with American cities. Let's go back to the 40s of the last century, in which the place was still an arsenal. It belonged to the Navy since more or less 300 years, more or less 400 years in the same place. And it was represented in this aerial photograph as a typical arsenal with docks, the shipyards, ramps, piers, and so on. So this is the most old representation of Lisbon, 1650, before the big earthquake that changed the morphology of the city forever. And in which you can recognize the castle and the tissue, the geomorphic tissue of the hill of the castle, the old neighbor of Alfama, the Islamic neighbor, and the royal palace that in this period moved from the castle to nearby the port and nearby the arsenal, giving a kind of meaningful presence to the moment in which Portuguese start being oriented to the world, to the unknown world, to the ocean. A few years before the earthquake, this representation still tells us about the hills, the valley, the royal square, the royal palace, and the complex infrastructure of the arsenal, with the piers, ramps, docks, and then the royal square with the bulwarks, the military fortifications, and the walls of the port of the city, and the douanes, we say douanes, the tax control, customs, okay. So typical infrastructure of the port, and then the city dance with the limits between hills, slopes, and the margin of the river Tejo. We have a tide, more or less 3 meters difference between low tide and high tide. Every 6 hours it moves 3 meters, so it's a lot. It's meaningful in terms of space. And this is the representation of the palimpsest. So after the big earthquake of 1755, who destroyed all the lower part of the city by the energy of the seismic waves, by the huge tsunami who got inside the city and destroyed the rest, and the fires that happened the subsequent days of the big earthquake. And this is the fast answer that the Prime Minister, this very enlightened and despotic man, Marquês de Pombal, ordered to his engineers and architects to develop. So 5 or 6 hypotheses were developed, always creating a very rational grid, not anymore with the royal palace that was placed here, but with the ministerium. So this means a shift in mentality, in politics, and in the way the city expressed the powers instituted. But you still can perceive the city that remained in red, the city that was designed in yellow, and you can note that all the arsenal was more or less there, because it was very, very well founded in the ground, and it was preserved and it enlarged also. So what we see is the tax buildings, we may say, the control tax buildings in the same place, the old port still in the same place with new walls, new tax buildings, more specialized in that period, but the same arsenal just beside the place that was the Royal Square, and now it's called Praça do Comércio. Comércio means trade. So there was a shift between the king and the traders. That was a huge mentality shift in this period. 1 century after it was done, the job, you can see this survey of 1856 shows that all the place was building according to the plans, and the arsenal was still there, consolidated, with a new element, a dry dock, we call that. This is confirmed in the next survey, and the iconography from several centuries is always speaking about the same thing. The dense city, the hill, the castle, the royal palace, the royal square, the port, and the twin space of the old arsenal. Well, you see it in several forms. So in this competition that was created to develop this space, we were asked, the competitors, we were asked to create 2 things: a public space, which should be a little bit green, and a closer contact between the city and the river. So it's a very important feature point to the inhabitants to have a close relation with the river, with the water, which has this tide movement every 6 hours. So we thought that we should add another point, very important point for us, and I'm talking about, I forgot, this was a competition I did with João Gomes, a colleague of mine, landscape architect. We joined efforts and we won this competition. So our methods start to be to try to understand what was this place, what was the spatial meaning of this place, what was there. And we start doing a kind of superposition method. We start superposing drawings from different periods, trying to understand what are the correlations between the present time, which was represented here, an avenue, and nothing of those structures were visible, and what was represented in the old maps. And within this tension, we start putting hypotheses of work. We also did a research with an historian on the archives. This is the Municipal Archive of Lisbon, showing pictures from that period with the piers, the way they were built, the ramps, the piers, the house which was serving to melt asphalt to work in naval construction. This is a very interesting picture with our last king and the queen, a very elegant queen and a very fat king, and the bourgeoisie and the ramps and the launch of a ship to the river. So this was the kind of temporary architecture that was built along 1 year, 2 years to allow construction, protection of the construction site during the summer, which can be very warm in Lisbon, and the winter, which can be very cold because we are very close. We are 10 kilometers far from the Atlantic coast, so it can be cold. And this is one image of the dry dock, which we knew it was there, but we didn't know what it looked like. So this is one of the pictures, working in dry conditions with the two doors closed. And suddenly we found this very amazing photograph in which all this reality I was showing disappeared with the construction of this diagonal avenue. Why? Because along the fascist regime, this was a place of troubles. It was a shipyard, so a lot of sailors and workmen. It was a very red place, full of convulsion and problems. But it was also the place where that king was killed, assassinated in 1909, and his son, the prince. Several ministers were also killed in that place. A lot of rebellions were smashed in that place. Our revolution in 74, which ended with fascist period and began with democracy, was also decided more or less in terms of military action in that place. So it's a very significant place that was erased for almost ever in the 40s by the construction of this avenue. And the meaning is not only political, it's also social, because it represents the triumph of the machine, of the transportation, of the need of transportation in the old center of the city, erasing 400 centuries place just with this gesture, just erasing reality from our vision. So I could say that nobody alive today knew that place unless by photographs. So we start researching. We found the last project for the place, which allowed us to confirm by archaeological excavation several specific points, which helped us to present this proposal and then to make it perfect, make it better than the initial proposals. So what we proposed was to create an alignment with the existing walls of the port, an alignment, a ramp which should allow everyone to go down to the river bed, which forms a kind of beach, sandy beach, when the tide is low. And in black stone, the basalt stone, to represent the place where water was. And to excavate with archaeology this dock and this dry dock and this pier. And in the position of the two ramps, which we saw in the picture with the king, to build two other ramps, this time with grass, not for putting ships out of the river, but to create a public space. So this was the main scheme we developed, and this is one of the developments of it. And this is a conceptual scheme we propose to. So the two main materials should be this white stone, which covers all the city of Lisbon. So all the pedestrian areas, all the most significant areas are covered with these white marble slabs or this kind of mosaic stones. And this is a kind of identity pattern. So we wanted to use it to identify all these areas, which were the docks. And then the black basalt in the area which was formerly occupied by water. So this kind of white marble and black basalt in reality are the natural history of Lisbon, because Lisbon was built as a landscape form upon former volcanic landscape in which this basalt is still present, and kind of marble appeared after the volcanic period. So this is the kind of master plan of the final version of the project. And this is more or less the process of the project, because when we start excavating, we didn't really had the confirmation of the right geometry. So we had to redesign over and over the plans to fix the final form by inserting the archaeological excavation in the right positions, and allowed us to obtain the final geometry. This is the construction phase, so a typical portico with a slab, inclinated slab, creating this ramp. And then the process of finishing with using white concrete and the same stone. We use the remains of the stone to mix with the white concrete and to obtain a kind of artificial stone, which somehow created this sequence of inclinated platforms very smoothly runs to the river. Some images of the constructive process, and this is after the inauguration. So this is the first experience of the new Ribeira das Naus, old arsenal. So what you see here is the high tide. So the water just goes in, and then when the low tide goes out, you have this kind of situation. This is the first winter. We shift the position of the diagonal avenue to this parallel position, and we started the second phase of this project, which you can perceive in the left part of the images. So the first spring, the river brought pieces of wood, some garbage. The vegetation starts invading these concrete ramps. Some folklore, of course. The old boats of the rivers were were again brought to the place to organize this kind of atmosphere. And then we start digging the docks, which were absolutely covered by ground. And we had a problem because all the infrastructure that was built after that period destroyed parts of these structures. So we had a problem of construction, how to consolidate old remains, some of them with more or less 400 years. You cannot deal with that easily. So we were working with archaeologists, with heritage technicians, I don't know how to call them, and we were discussing constructive process, methods of rebuilding. We studied the materials, the concrete that was used in that time. We did work with similar materials, always with slightly different geometry, more or less 10 centimeters shift position of the plans, the new and the old. And we start building also the two ramps, of course using concrete, not stone, only stone here to frame the concrete pouring. I don't know how to explain. So we embedded these vertical stones to create frames for the concrete slabs. So using the same prefab methods that was used for the reconstruction of Baixa after the earthquake, using prefab cutted stones. So this is a final image, already using green surfaces, which were very much pretended by the mayors. But we also thought that we should avoid typical urban elements like the system of lighting in the gardens. So it would create a forest of pillars of enlightening pillars. So we start avoiding the common urban language, and we start using more rough materials to separate stone with grass. We start using, for example, just two huge masts to create general lighting of the area. So we start trying to avoid a typical urban center language and to approach a little bit more what was the industrial character of the site, which was much more rough than friendly. So some images. The dry dock was excavated 1/3. We are waiting for more money to excavate the rest and to consolidate the destructed surface of that structure. So it's a process which should keep going on. And of course, people start occupying the place. So this is the first spring. I must say that in the summer, visitors, not the locals, but the visitors, start using this ramp as a beach, as an urban beach. So they start taking out clothes, bikini, and all these fantastic new habits. And it was amazing because until then, the social habits were not sitting in the ground, were not taking clothes off, having sun bath. So something changed in the center of the city, mostly because visitors, foreigners, start using that space in a much more free way than we were used to. So this is the connection between the Praça do Comércio and Ribeira das Naus. I forgot to tell you that this is the Admiralty. So the Navy is still there since 400 years. They are still there, occupying those buildings. And we had to create a system for fencing that area with security. And this system is made of panels that can rotate and open once they want to create a public event. So this is also transforming the character of this area. which was very closed, very obscured, and now it's becoming something much more friendly. And this is the most significant moment for me when the dock that was excavated start to receive the water of the tide, because it's connected with the river, and it pumps. It has the rhythm of the tide. So every 6 hours the tide goes up inside the dock and goes down. So you have a kind of natural perception of the tides in a space that was never until recently was never open to this reality. So it was very fast. It was a surprise for me how this could be fast. It was a question of minutes in which the place changed again to this reality. So this is a competition just beside the other, which we didn't won. It was a partnership between our studio, Global, Pedro Pacheco, which is a young architect of my age, and Paratelier, which is an office of my former colleagues of studio, 2 Italians, which I decided to invite with us to work in this competition. So it has to do with this idea, this possibility of reusing the matter of the past as a possibility of building our relation with the present. This is an idea of Giorgio Agamben, an Italian philosopher, which I had the privilege to hear, to follow along a cycle of conferences in Mendrisio Academia. And he was very much inquiring about our relation with the past. He was saying that probably the crisis in Europe is not only about economics, but mostly it's a crisis of relation with the past. We don't understand really what is our present without understanding our past. So I took this idea very firmly, and I'm rethinking a lot about it. So it has to do with about the potential of the invisibility of a place. It has to do about these 2 very strange words, palindrome and palimpsest, in which palimpsest represents the rewriting of a text upon the same text, which is an idea that was brought to architecture and landscape architecture. I can remind you James Corner text about palimpsest, which helps a lot on this. And the palindrome, which represents the idea of changing the order of the levels, the sequence of the levels. And of course, about the idea between memory and contemporary life. So this is Praça do Comércio, this is the castle, this is the dock of the arsenal, and this is the space which was the subject of a competition to rehabilitate. And our hypothesis was provocative, of course, and it was very much in the sequence of the work we were completing in that time in Ribeira das Naus. And the hypothesis was to excavate the system of the old walls of the port, creating a depression in between the old part of the city and the old port and the new port, which was raised in the 20th century. So by creating a new excavation of that border of the river, we were able to put in contact different times of the same space and somehow bring to present life, to contemporary life, a part of our very important memory. All those buildings should be, that were all tax buildings. So this one was to tax the grain. This other was to tax the wine that arrived to the port. And there was one here that disappeared, and we proposed to rehabilitate, to reuse one of the warehouses that were there. Should be the tax building for spices. And you might know that during the 16th and 17th century, we had a strong commercial relation with all the Asiatic region, India coast and China coast. And all this trade with those regions in terms of spices, commercial, was very important. It was more or less controlled through this building and some of the others. So our hypothesis was to bring back to our days and to try to think how could we create a new architecture for this landscape by excavating, by trying to get in contact with those remains and trying to find a sense for that. So this is the model we did, in which by extracting this excavation, we could reveal this wall, we could give meaning to ramps, to stairs, to those buildings, and most of all we could again create the perception about the relation between the dense city, the port city, the new port city, and the place that was the former beach and it was the former port. So this section reveals the castle, the hill, the front of the city, the illuministic buildings from after the earthquake, and the dock of the new port, and the idea of creating a kind of linear park at the level of the former beach. So another scheme, a section which show us the medieval cathedral, the landscape of the city, the urban landscape formed by terraces. So this was the way of building that slope, creating terraces and building against the terraces, and creating this system of relation by excavating this platform and then creating underground parking just beside the dock. So this was our proposal. So we studied very carefully the construction details of the port. We also did some research on archaeology of the place, and we found the typology, the dimensions more or less of those walls, and this is a typical section of our operation. To excavate the maximum we could, to create a kind of canal with water, to reveal more vertical surface, to create a park, a linear park in the sand with a sandy floor, and to insert the new infrastructure of the parking plot. So under this we have a lot of contemporary infrastructure passing by. We have the metro station, metro line passing through, and we were proposing also this kind of pavilion, this kind of prismatic, pentagonal prismatic building done in concrete with the same stones that existed all around. And each floor should have a window facing specific parts of the town or of the place. And this could and should act as a kind of key decipher, key, I don't know, the key communication about the history of the place. It should work in that way. So we studied the urban system, the complex, because it's the center of the city, how to separate public transport with private transport. We proposed to reinstall the tram to connect not only the central station, but also the new cruise terminal, which is going to be built here, but also serving the neighbors which live in Alfama. You see the walls, Alfama, and the old Jew quarter also, and the Baixa system. So we created a very systematic reading of the problem, and then the typical profiles of the roads. So we dealt also with traffic engineers. We had to study the problem a lot. And these schematic representations allowed us to perceive what is the relation we are trying to reestablish with the memory of that place. So the fourth experiment has to do with the overlapping cities, and those are the port city, which has a port authority completely independent from the municipal authorities, and that doesn't communicate until recently. And this problem of contact and was somehow the result of this competition. We won together with Carril de Graça, the architect, the other architect I already told you about the Castle project, and it has to do with this specific place known as Gardens of Tobacco as a place, and the new terminal, cruises terminal station. So I'm talking about this space, not far from the former one, and it has to do with one hypothesis that we put it in competition, which somehow tried to intensify the perception, the contemporary perception of the place. So what happened is that the port authorities, before launching the competition, decided to erase one of the docks here and decided to expand the platform of the port. So they just overlap and erase that part of the port. So this is the relation with the hills, a perception of, this is very distorted, but it's the perception of the relation between the dock platform and the hill. This is a competition moment, the contact between the 19th century walls and the new slab of the port. And this is the dock which was about to disappear in the moment of the competition. So you still can perceive this white stone wall which enclosed the docks and constructs all the 14 kilometers of the Lisbon waterfront. So this was the moment of the competition. This is the position of this plot in that old map I showed you before, 1650. So you can perceive more or less where we are. And this is a very interesting representation of the palimpsest created by the construction of the modern port, which is the port of the beginning of the 20th century, which somehow created a new platform in the position of the sandy beach of the riverside. So in red, it's the proposal, the several proposals of the port, and in red also it's the expansion of the city to the inner part of the plateau of Lisbon. So it represents a moment in which Lisbon just expanded not only to the inner part of that platform, but also along the riverside, and conquered expanded a new part inside the river. So many significant buildings like the central station were touching the river in that time, as you see. And this is the model which somehow explains the area of competition and our hypothesis. So this is not a physical model, but this is a digital model. And our hypothesis was to open all this area which was fenced and belonged to the port authorities to the city, and to excavate again a part of this dock, more in this side, less in this side, and to place here the pavilion of the dock, the cruise terminal station. So this is one of the images, obligatory images of the competition, taken from the castle to allow us to perceive the impact. So you see the big ships, 16 floors high, so more or less the level of the basement of the castle. And this is our concept, which was to create a kind of park with alleys, 3 alleys, which should organize the programs, and at the same time to create a very concentrated pavilion to solve the cruise terminal problematic. And these are the passerelle which allowed you to connect to the boats, which can be 5 at the same time, which could mean 8,000 people just disembarking in 2 hours in Lisbon. So it's really shifting the quality of space. So I think this image of doing something very concentrated, which represents a kind of belvedere over Alfama, over the city, and the idea of creating a park, a kind of public space, was very seductive for the jury. This is the master plan, in which you see the old buildings, the city, the old wall here represented, and the 2 docks, the one which disappeared here, and the position of the pavilion with these elements, these galleries like in an airport. And we should be aware that this borderline, which is a fence passing here, it's one of the frontiers of Europe. It's Schengen limit, which means that here you have to have a very tight control of access, because it's not a frontier between 2 countries in Europe, which now are open, like in the United States, between two states. This is the frontier between the ocean, which means the rest of the world, and Europe. So you have to be very careful about security and all these processes. So we convinced the port authorities that we could shift the limits from here to here, and we could overlap the 2 cities, the port city and the city of Lisbon. So this means that all this space that is organized to receive between more or less 2 hours a lot of bus to collect the passengers and to put them in the city. But in the rest of the time of the day is public space. We convinced them to open this park to the city and to create a public square, the remain of the dock as a kind of lake, public representation of the dock with the same deepness, the same experience, and 2 pavilions, which were houses, and 2 gardens. So it's a urban system of a sequence of spaces organized by an alley and related with the old city. So that was one of the images of the competition. The impact from the river, simulated in section. So the scale of the building is lower than the other buildings, so it creates not an obstruction but a kind of natural sequence. And those are drawings and expectations, optimistic expectations about the building. The building is very much open by the 2 sides. You can disembark and have a clear perception of the old part of the city. And I must say that this shifting position of the cruise terminal station just boosted the amount of ships demanding Lisbon. So now they doubled the cruise terminal areas, and you must imagine that arriving to Lisbon through the Canal River and then to turn around like a kind of dance like this and facing the city, it's probably one of the most fascinating experiences you can have to arrive to Lisbon. So it really worked, the decision of moving here the second pool of the cruise terminal. So our proposal is now beginning the construction phase, and we are hoping to have this optimistic vision in 2 years. Well, some drawings. So the last experience is an installation, not a project, and it served as a kind of negotiation between the port authorities and the city, municipal authorities. When they start creating a dialogue, allowing that a certain part of the port areas should be classified as exclusive activity for the port, the other should be classified as exclusive use of the city, and those who were strategic for the port but not used could be used by the city in a midterm period. So creating a linear connection all along the riverside was one argument they decided to experiment by opening these areas which were somehow open to the city in a midterm period. So we call it a trace on memory because it should deal with the huge differences occurring all along the 7 kilometers of that part of the cycle path. So it was a competition we won associated with this office P06, which is an office of graphic artists, as they call. And our strategy was really developed about this collaboration. So this is the half of Lisbon, the occidental half of Lisbon. This is the center. Ribeira das Naus is more or less there. And this is Torre de Belém, which is one of the oldest naval buildings of the city from the beginning of the 16th century, which used to serve as a military position at the same time the control of the ships that were demanding the port of Lisbon. So, as you might notice, we are crossing shipyards, recreation docks, areas that were already given to the city, and other docks from the port of Lisbon for recreation and docks, some building, very important building, and the more monumental area of Belém, which somehow works as one of the most significant eccentric cores of the city from the 16th century period. And our proposal was because we didn't have much money, we just had 3.5 meters large strip by 7 kilometers and more or less 400,000 euros, which is more or less $500,000. So it's not much considering the extension of the area. So our common decision was to propose that the material should not be a red painting, a red asphalt, but our material should be black and white, which, as you know, is not a material, a substance, but two colors. Why? Because we understood that the problem here was not about creating a surface, but identifying that surface. So it was much more about creating legibility and habits of moving along the river, and not creating a fixed or a definitive path. So we start working about a communication system, signs painted or inserted or embedded in the surfaces. And we decide also to choose a poem from Fernando Pessoa, which is a modernist poet, Portuguese by birth, but from the world, I may say. And a poem which talks about the River Tejo. I cannot translate it. You have in my webpage, you have the poem translated in English. And it's very beautiful because it's very ambiguous. It talks about Tejo River, it talks about a small creek in his supposed hometown, and he compares one and the other, and the beauty of one and the beauty of other. But he concludes saying that Tejo is the most beautiful one because from its village it can go to the world, and that's the most beautiful message of the poem. So we decide to inscribe this poem along these 7 kilometers. So we start studying like a kind of metro line system, understanding what are the relations we could establish in terms of information, and we start developing this idea that if we eliminate some surfaces, we could obtain others. If we add paintings, we could create a communication system. So we start digging and we start proposing to relate with other materials, as you shall see. For example, the old warehouses received this kind of provocation. Now, this was 7 years ago. Now this building was completely renewed, and now it's working as bars and nightclubs and restaurants. So this really start moving the process of urban rehabilitation. And we start inscribing in existing pavement this kind of signs to orientate your path. And then we start digging out that asphalt, and we found these two, how do you say these metallic lines for cranes move? I don't know, we are track with this. I'm sorry. We start, and then we found that these 3.5 meters were there, so we could use it. And we start revealing these substances of the old port, which creates our perception of the identity of the place. We also carved linear surfaces, and we planted more or less 300 ashes, fraxinus. So we created a new alley, a very extensive one, and we started inscribing the poem and other signs. So this is the kind of intervention, sometimes asphalt, some others, the existing paving, just doing contours, avoiding existing positions, and we just used 5 very expensive benches, which I happen to found here in your school also, and this created to the community the perception that this wasn't anymore old asphalt parking plot, but could be a promenade and a very calm place to stay just in front of the river, which can be very placid, very, very calm, and can be very stormy. But we start conquering these parking plots and transforming it in a promenade and in a running track, in a cycle path and car circulating. We didn't have money to drain, so we put these elements to separate, and we dig holes in it to allow water to circulate. So this kind of very pragmatic approach, and this is the kind of atmosphere we can experience. And this is distance, measuring distance, finishing the poem, and finishing the path in Torre de Belém. Thank you. If you have any questions you want to put. Yeah. I think there is a strong conflict between conservatives and progressives. It's an old political discussion. But what is probably a misunderstanding is that conservating doesn't mean you cannot use or reuse those elements. We can be speaking about nature conservation, but also cultural heritage conservation. And what we try to do in several projects, the first one was the prototype of the others, was to be able to establish a relation with very conservative forces, which normally are archaeologists, because they dig, they became fascinated by what they found, and it's legitimate. And then they don't know what to do with that. So sometimes they want to cover, sometimes they want to do something that doesn't touch those remains. But I think there is, I must say, in the last 20 years, there is an attempt to create a relation between architects, landscape architects, and archaeologists. We had a program, a public program, to rehabilitate our heritage most significant buildings, not the central ones, but those in out of cities, which were in a decadence phase again. They were preserved and rebuilt in the fascist period as a tool of political identity, nationalist identity. But now they were going under a process of decadence. So what this public program tried to do was to install what we call heritage hotels on those convents, castles, old buildings, which were about to be non-conservated because a lack of funds and money. So they start calling very, very significant architects to do these kind of jobs, and you can see the best Portuguese architects, some of them very known, working in the rehabilitation of these buildings. So dealing with heritage problems, dealing with this kind of very conservative forces. And this was a huge problem in the beginning, and step by step, what we understood all is that it was missing a talk, it was missing dialogue, it was missing the collaboration. And that's the key point to solve many of our contemporary problems. We cannot solve them isolated as architects or as engineers or as landscape architects or as, I don't know, ecologists. We had to deal with these problems in a much broader way. We need to conciliate points of view. We need to use all those points of view as a major strength. And then we can face complex problems as the problems we have today. Today it's not only a problem of putting money in rehabilitating an old heritage ruin or preserving a natural area. It's a problem of finding a much more complex economical and social meaning to that problem. So reality is much more complex than in the past, and we have to join forces. So many of those projects came from this evidence of the need of a dialogue between professions, between different visions, and the capacity of creating the present and the future, of course. The Carrilho de Graça, the architect, used to say, I have a huge respect about the past, but I have a bigger one about the future. So I think he's very clear about that. I don't know if I addressed. More questions or comments?